My very considerable regret that I won't be here for the entirety of this final session of the Regional Studies Association's meeting here in Tampere, and my sincere apologies to the presenters and everyone else who is here at the conference. But as David intimated, Sally and I are about to catch a flight for which I have to leave after the first presentation in this session to China, because we were having discussions with Weidong about the establishment of a Chinese division of the Regional Studies Association and how best to progress that. As many of you will be aware, RSA has had a considerable interest in China for quite some time with our global conference there last year, and we see this as a wonderful opportunity to extend the network, to bring other scholars into our activities, into our journal publications and into our conferences in order to make an even stronger global community of scholars. So please accept my apologies, and I look forward to perhaps reporting back to you with some good news in the not too distant future. I thought I'd give you some statistics about this conference and the wonderful success that I know we all recognise it to be. We've had 320 participants from 43 countries. We've heard 254 papers in 91 workshops and plenary sessions over more than 2.5 days. We've held several special sessions, including ones on the shift to open access publishing and how that will have an impact on academics. We've also held a top tips meeting for early career researchers on how to present. We've held an early career and student networking session. We've had 2 receptions, including one at the Old City Hall last night and a gala dinner, which I think everyone enjoyed immensely, in the Customs House, as well as a floorball tournament for which the war stories are still coming. We've also launched our 2 new conferences in Izmir, Turkey, and in Brazil, and we'll be sure to send you the full details of those 2 events very soon. I'd like to thank you for coming to Tampere and for contributing to the debates, and thank you for continuing to support this learned society. Before I finish, let me urge you to be active in your membership and to take advantage of the full benefits that the RSA membership offers. Continue to come to our conferences and events, read and submit to our publications, apply for our grants, bursaries and other grant-related schemes, spread the word about the RSA and our programs, and help us to grow our community and our contribution to policy development and implementation. So may I wish you all a safe journey home, and thank you once again for coming and making this conference such a considerable success. Thank you.
Just to add to that, the association's treasurer, Alistair Ray, couldn't be here as his wife gave birth yesterday. So we've got a new RSA member we can announce. I've been looking forward to this session very much. We've got 3 very interesting speakers today. Markus Sotaratu, who we all know, Martin Kenny and Simone Strambach. First up today is Marku. He needs no introduction, of course, but he's Dean of the Management School here at the University of Tampere. He's written extensively on local and regional economic development, regional innovation systems, leadership, institutional change and institutional entrepreneurship. And it's on that latter area that he's speaking today, asking the question, what is there to learn? I'm sure we'll learn very much from you. Marku, over to you.
It is nice to see that there are so many of you left in the survival session. I actually like that phrase a lot. And as you also may know, there are quite a lot of papers and perhaps also books coming up on regional resilience. And if you think what is regional resilience, it's you, because you are still here, and not so resilient individuals, they are somewhere else. Yes, my talk will be about institutional entrepreneurship and innovation systems. I warn you, this will be quite conceptual presentation. Institutional entrepreneurship is a concept we have been experimenting with. There are certain pros and cons in using it, we have learned. It's a concept that has not been so much used in innovation system or local economic regional development studies, and I try to convince you that it is a concept that is worth exploring more. And our point of departure is coming from Merrick Gertler, his article in 2010. Actually, our project that is based on the concept of institutional entrepreneurship began already 2008. So it was nice to have a big guru convincing us that we are doing the right thing. But quite often in our fields, there are quite a lot of studies focusing on networks or really detailed analysis of micro-level things. And then most of us are focusing on the question why certain regions grow, why certain regions don't grow, what kind of transformation processes are going on there. And usually, personally, I miss people. We don't see much people around in our studies. We see structural changes, systems, etc., etc. And some years ago, I can't remember exactly, perhaps 5, 6, no, it was 2006, we asked ourselves a question: what is going on, not only in Finland, but more broadly in Europe, in the local economic, regional economic development scenes? Because we are interacting a lot with Finnish ministries, regions, cities, and also beyond Finland. And what we have been seeing is that what people do nowadays in the field of policy and regional development practice is quite different from what they were doing in the 80s and early 90s. And we asked ourselves a question: what are they doing and why they are doing what they are doing? And we made a big survey, we interviewed a lot of people, and yes, we came up to the answer: they are leading networks instead of planning, implementing, evaluating. They are doing all that also, but they are much more focusing on building partnerships, keeping them alive, as we all know. But I think we showed, with using our survey and interviews, that they are actually at the micro level taking leadership positions without having leadership positions. So there was a lot of informal leadership in place, so to say. And that has led us to think more about leadership. And quite often, when you are studying leadership in this kind of setting, people ask a question: so what? And I have heard many times people saying that, yeah, okay, Markku is saying that leadership is causing structural change in certain place. No, I have never said that. I am simply interested in seeing how processes and networks are led in the context of local, regional economic development and innovation systems. I'm interested in processes as such, not the outcomes of them. But when studying leadership, we also end up asking ourselves a question: what is the relationship between structure and agency, the eternal question of social sciences? And I didn't find any good concept to use in that setting, and then I found the concept of institutional entrepreneurship from organizational studies. And then in my small thinking, I thought, institution, something structural, something quite big. Entrepreneurship, people taking risk, seeing opportunities, working actively to do something. There might be something to experiment with, to work with, and then we started learning and reading about institutions, institutional entrepreneurship, and institutional entrepreneurship literature was quite easy because there aren't so much on that. It is expanding in organizational studies, but it's still a literature that can be handled. There is something like 100 articles or so at the moment, but the literature on institutions, it's like a swamp. You start reading, and more you read, the more lost you are. And then at one point, well, I was very grateful for John Tomani yesterday because he helped me to understand certain things I haven't understood so far. But anyway, my question is, what is the place, or what could the place of institutional entrepreneurship be in the regional, or more broadly, innovation puzzle? What is the conceptual place of that? I will say a few words about the consensus, as I see it, we have in innovation system studies, some critique to it. I will introduce the key concepts as I understand them. I raise very quickly a few empirical observations from institutional entrepreneurship studies, and more or less that's it. I go very quickly through the consensus. If you disagree with me, you can start jumping up and down now or later, but this is how I see it. There are quite a lot of studies on innovation systems. This literature has been emerging for 20 years, a little bit more. Drawing from Erkko Autio, our Finnish colleague in London, he is dividing, and quite many of us are dividing innovation systems to knowledge-creating subsystem, knowledge-utilizing subsystem, and then there are increasing literature on all the relevant economic, social, and political institutions that are framing these two subsystems and the entire innovation system. Then in the literature we can find different kind of analyses or lists, however you want to put it. What are the institutions? And I'll come back to that soon. And then we assume that this is leading to development, diffusion, and use of new knowledge. That, again, is important for individuals and especially organizations' learning capacity, stressed by Bent-Åke Lundvall especially. And, of course, this should all lead to ability to innovate, and in the end, there should be innovations, something new that is implemented and bringing value added to our social or economic life. And then looking at the innovation system literature, it seems that we have created a huge matchmaking industry. If we are looking what people interested in innovation systems are studying, they are studying relationships, networks, partnerships, universities' role in industrial development, or as increasingly has been the effort to study knowledge flows. And when we are studying knowledge flows, what we are basically doing is we are, I would say, studying cooperation, collaboration, partnerships, etc. But we are more using the word knowledge to find out who is cooperating with whom. But this is what's going on in this field. But what I am interested in is this black box here. We like black boxes, don't we? The question is how and why certain new practices or new organizational forms come into existence and become well established in innovation systems. Because that's the question policymakers ask us quite often. Okay, we know clusters. We know that it's important to have an MIT kind of university influencing the economic development throughout the world. Should have institutions, you should have institutions for that, might be our answer. And then we give a list what we need. And then we see innovation policy quite often as actions that public organizations do explicitly for this kind of innovation system. It depends on country or region or locality what they are emphasizing, but we quite often see innovation policy as something outside the system that tries to enhance it somehow, some way. And I would say that studying institutional entrepreneurship, our view on policy may change. But institutionalization is, for us, it's a process of new practice, activity, norm, belief, or some other institution that becomes established in the system, organization, culture. What is the target of observation? And if something becomes institutionalized, it has attained a high degree of resilience. It is becoming one of the things we want to change again, if you like. It becomes like a ruling collective thought and social action, and usually in the institutionalization process, there is also emergence of collective actors that are working to institutionalize something and then protect it. And this is important part of an institutionalization process. And quite often in our field, I would say, our focus is on institutions and how they affect the variety in time and place. Varieties of capitalism literature is a good example of that, I think. Then we may also study how institutions affect the actors and their relations, how it affects, in the end, innovation. So we take institution as a corner block of our studies, and then we see how they affect other actors. I come back to that picture quite soon. There is criticism, of course. We like also, in addition to black boxes, we like to criticize ourselves and each other, and that's good. There are several people arguing that in the field of innovation, regional innovation systems studies, we quite often focus on existence or absence of actors. This is put forward by Elvira Ujarra and Kieran Flanagan especially, that we don't actually study organizations or individuals as purposive agents, but rather that's something that exists or doesn't exist. And when we are comparing our regions or European countries, we focus on existence or absence. And this has been fine, but I would say not anymore. We need to see somebody doing also something. Also, there has been criticism that in this field we have a quite narrow definition of institutions, a bit simplified way of seeing institutions, and then we try to predefine them. And I always try to find good empirical studies asking a question, what the institutions actually are in certain situations. I will come back to definition of institutions soon. And quite often we also focus on local level, regional level, or national level, or international, but we don't see the multiscalar effect of institutions. That is hugely difficult, of course. But if we take a micro view, we start analyzing processes, then we ask a question, what institutions are framing the decisions and actions made in this specific situation? And then some of the national institutions that we usually think that are very powerful, they may have no role at all, framing decisions and actions. This is a simple way of defining institutions. What is defining our actions and decisions? When I was a child, it was my mother and father, of course. But my mother and father were not your institutions. I think you have had your own institutions. University of Tampere is, to a certain extent, defining decisions and actions of many organizations here in Tampere, but not perhaps in California. Perhaps we are so powerful that we are also influencing University of Stanford, but I think not yet, to be honest. Then there is, of course, the question, what is the role of innovation policymakers? There has been criticism that we too often see innovation policymakers as engineers who design some desirable states of affairs. Like we have some kind of toolbox, and then we take the right tool and then we start screwing, really screwing sometimes, things in proper places. Everybody who is studying policy processes wouldn't recognize this kind of view of policymaking at all. In policy studies, this kind of understanding of policymaking, I would say, does not exist anymore. Hasn't existed for a long, long time, because it's more or less political process. From evolutionary point of view, we might learn that policymaker is an adapter who is not optimizing. It's a system that is more or less imitating or experimenting, trying things, and trial and error process. Or we might say that the question is about learning, that policymaking is actually a learning process and policymakers are somehow affecting our meta-rationals, how we see innovation systems, regions, nations, etc. And that is that kind of change of our thinking patterns is always behind what is actually going on in the world. But it is adapting process, but not in a way that it's seen in evolutionary approach, but more like a learning process that is at the same time adapting and changing ourselves and how we view innovation. But my point is that we should have this link better established in our models and theories. We should also understand how actors, their different forms of collaboration affect the institutions that are framing our decisions and choices. And this leads us to the concept of institutional entrepreneurship. This concept was introduced by Paul DiMaggio in late 80s, I have to check. Institutional entrepreneurs can be individuals, can be organizations, depends on the study you are making, what you find. But institutional entrepreneurs are supposed to be labeled as one, to have an interest in certain institutional arrangements. And they are mobilizing resources consistently, they have competencies to create new institutions, or they transform the existing ones, they institutionalize something, they initiate divergent changes and actively participate in the implementation of these changes, and they take the lead. And my point here is that by trying to find these kind of actors, are there such? What they do? Why they do what they do, with whom they do, are they organizations, individuals? We are not only learning new forms of policy making and practice, but we are also learning what's going on inside regional innovation systems or national sector or whatever you are focusing on. And then the question always is, as I have said several times, what are the institutions framing our actions and decisions? Institutions are usually in the literature defined as patterns of behavior, performance scripts that provide stable designs for chronically repeated activity sequences. I took that one because, at least for a Finn, it sounds so sophisticated. I'm not if it's that, but you get the picture of what institutions might mean. We have been using also Scott's definition or his institutional pillars that divide between regulative, normative, cultural, cognitive institutional pillars, and then from economics they also quite often, especially in innovation system studies, the institutions are seen as rules of the game. But basically the playground, the rules of the game, those things that are rather permanent, stable, and relatively resistant to change. For a quite long time, if I have understood correctly, institutions have been something that is resisting change, but now more often than earlier, we are also seeing the enabling role of the institutions. I guess you know, most of you must know the game of football. You must know that there is a country in Southern Europe that has been, and I think still is, quite good in football, Spain. You may know that we are also playing football in Finland, and there are teams practicing playing football. We are having a stadium quite close to our university. We know the rules of the game. That's not a problem. We can get coaches from abroad. We don't have money to have players people are having in UK, Germany, Spain, etc. But we know the rules of the game. We know all the institutions framing the game, but still, we are not doing so well, to be honest. I know the vice chairman of Finnish Football Association is working for School of Management here, and so I am always updated what's going on in Finnish football scene. We are trying hard. The more we try, we don't improve, but we can change the institutions. We take football to swamp. And we introduce the World Championships in swamp football. And see those Spanish guys. And what you don't see is all the mosquitoes. I don't actually know who won the World Championship last year, but I think it was not the Spanish team. This is an example of changing the playground, changing the rules, having the same game, and suddenly we are doing fine. You may think that this is a far-stretched example. Think what's going on in the world. There is 3D printing emerging. And what I am surprised is that Tampere, that is the leading manufacturing site in Finland still, the companies and policymakers are not talking about 3D printing at all. I think they should. I will, if I have time, I'll very quickly jump through one of the cases we have been studying, how stem cells, biomaterial research comes together, and how a new form of medicine is emerging and meeting a lot of resistance also in the hospitals, because they are facing all the institutions. Or think about what happened in Rochester, USA, how copier camera industry transformed itself to optoelectronics. There has been a huge amount of institutions that has had to be changed somehow. But how it happened? We know the stories. We know how tire industry transformed to polymer industry in Akron, Ohio, etc., etc. And if we think the institutions that are usually listed in our field of study, there must have been huge changes looking at these cases in training and competence building system, the research structure, are the investment routines. If you are investing in camera industry, it must be very different from investing in optoelectronics, etc., etc. And my question always is how the change happened, so to say. And that's what I'm interested in, and using institutional entrepreneurship is one concept to tackle with that change. Some empirical observations from different studies. First of all, the criticism I always face, okay, you are promoting the idea of heroic leadership. No, I am not. I have never been like that, no. What we have seen and what the other studies have seen, that there are no single heroic leaders or groups of leaders, but rather it's always a question of collective processual form of agency. But yes, there are always a lot of people who are trying to get credit what has happened, but they are not totally honest. So institutional entrepreneurship is a collective processual form of agency. Quite often, this comes from the study of functional foods here in Finland, and quite often it's an unplanned, highly personal, intuitive form of agency that in certain stages take advantage of policies and change the policies, but there is no big plan. I'll come back to that also. This is coming from nanotechnology in packaging industry, and Heikko Kulva, I don't know how to pronounce his name, but he shows that the institutional framework is actually a patchwork. There are a lot of conflicting and aligned institutions affecting the packaging in the Netherlands. And what the institutional entrepreneurs try to do, they try to influence that part of the patchwork they can influence. You make a small change, for instance, in the university education, then in regulation, somewhere else, and you are changing the patchwork slowly, softly, and at one point, you have what you've seen is new institutions emerging. But this is really difficult to see. Usually we see the outcome, but not the process. James Carlsen and his Basque colleagues studied changing university roles in the Basque country. They studied how certain universities transformed from mode 1 to mode 2, if you know the Gibbons word, and they also used the concept of institutional entrepreneurship, and what they saw that in this case, there were people who actively bridged between the macro-level changes and micro-level changes that resulted to new forms of university activity. And Rory and Landau studied nuclear science in Israel and how it, in the course of decades, changed from pure basic research, from very applied, very market-oriented research. And it is interesting how they analyze how institutional entrepreneurs, those people who consciously tried to change nuclear research in Israel, and that's quite a volatile issue, if you remember something from the history, and how they played with emerging visions, old visions, and consciously tried to construct new visions. And in this case, this kind of vision work was the core of institutional change, but it was not something like that we introduce a new vision and then we start implementing it. But it was a long, long process where the old and new ways of thinking with the concept of vision met each other. I think I have 3.5 minutes if my internal clock is correct. This is a study we have been doing here by ourselves on institutionalization of regenerative medicine in Tampere, and this is a paper hopefully forthcoming next year. And I know that Andrew looks frustrated because this is 4th time you hear this example, but 5th time, okay. But regenerative medicine is believed to be the 3rd mode so to say, in medicine. You can take drugs, you can have a surgery, but in the future, what is believed that basically any human organ can be grown out of your own stem cells. Here in Tampere, at our university, we actually have a very good research group that has collaborated closely with Tampere University of Technology, and they have introduced technology that can basically replace most part of facial bone. And the first really successful case was in 2008. There was a man in his mid-50s, didn't have a bone here at all, just a hole in the face. It's the red part in the skull. And what they did, this is from the patent, very quickly, they took stem cells out of this man's fatty tissues, did them something I can't explain. I'm not in that field of stem cells. But they started growing the stem cell biomass. Then they created a titanium frame that was exactly the same shape as that guy's missing piece of upper jaw. And they put the titanium frame inside the stomach muscle of that man, and after 6 months they took it out, and there was full upper jaw with blood vessels and everything, and he is now perfect. And they have been doing these kind of surgeries more than 30 times at the moment, and one has failed, everything else has succeeded. But it's like a science fiction. You are growing bones for you inside your stomach muscle, sometimes in your back muscle. I don't know why it's sometimes back muscle and sometimes stomach muscle. And then we asked the question, how did it come to be here in Tampere? What made this kind of innovation possible? So we started with this kind of innovation, and we didn't, as such, well, there's other studies made that focus more on the community around this thing, but we started what I would call process track. We tracked the process, how it came to be. Somebody calls it innovation biography. But we went through all the documents, studies, minutes, etc., and interviewed, of course, lots of people. And now I go very quickly. The seeds of the changed phase was based on 2 professors, one from our university, one from Tampere University of Technology, who were really good, and the other one in fatty tissues and the other one in biomaterials. And they both had hunts, scientific hunts, that in their fields there is something more. They couldn't give labels to it, they couldn't, they were able to argue for it in a scientific way, but they weren't able to reach even the leadership of the universities because people were saying that, okay, let's go and publish. But they were able to start conversations with what we call policy support community, City of Tampere, Center of Expertise Program, regional development agencies, who are specialized in understanding complex worlds in a sense that they understood that these guys, they have something. There is something to work with, because at the same time they followed what's going on in the USA in biotechnology research, etc. And in the first phase, it was the professors who could be labeled as institutional entrepreneurs because they launched this process. They were not able to carry it. But local and regional practitioners, policy peoples, in cooperation with clinical community and universities, started constructing kind of collective belief. And the collective belief is that this is huge business. It is growing. Let's go directly to business venture. I am simplifying now a lot, but this was the basic idea. They even made the business plan, and when it was made, they realized that in the world there is not a single profitable company yet. And the whole business is still to emerge. And in that stage, this kind of process could have faded away, as already earlier. And then the conversation moved back to the university. The idea was to have a research unit for this kind of research, and if you can't make business, let's concentrate on research, and the process was led by the university, especially the director for established center, and at the moment, exactly when we speak, I heard this morning, our 2 universities are again having, how would I put it, friendly discussion with a lot of issues, how to have a joint biomeditech institute with more than 200 scientists around this idea, because all of this is based on engineering, biology, and medicine, and combinations of them. But now this thinking has been institutionalized here, but this is far from ready. But at every stage, the actors have changed, not consciously, but simply because new people have been needed. David starts throwing something at me very soon, and that's why I conclude very quickly that, first of all, institutional entrepreneurship is not to be located in the attributes of actors or individuals, but relationships, connecting these actors after we have identified them in an innovation system and institutional change. And also, we are learning new roles of policymaking when doing this kind of studies. I didn't talk about changing roles of policymaking, but we see different roles for policymaking than what we usually see, and institutional change is creeping by nature. It's very seldom is radical because it has started long, long before we see anything. And only by studying micro-level agency, we can understand the process before something radical happens. Thank you for your attention, and I let you read the other conclusions and not take time saying anything of them. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Markku, for an excellent overview of the area and also some very interesting examples. I thought the swamp football in particular reminded me of a recent football game I saw at West Bromwich Albion, but anyway, super. Thank you very much. Our next speaker in this session is Martin Kenny. He's a professor at the University of California, Davis, and a senior project director at the Berkeley Roundtable on the International Economy. He's published very widely on university industry technology transfer, venture capital, new industry formation, and technology-enabled globalization. He's speaking today on the topic of returnee entrepreneurs and the Chinese high-technology economy. Martin, over to you when you're ready.
Is it going to happen? Yep, it is. Okay. Great. Thank you very much, David, and thank you, Markku, for inviting me. This is going to be a little bit different than most of the presentations that I have seen today and at the meetings, and I've learned quite a bit. Seems like institutional entrepreneurship is a very big topic at the moment. I'm going to talk about 3 strands of research that I'm doing right now. This is going to be pretty down and dirty empirical rather than theoretical in quite the same way as we've been seeing before. Let's see. Okay. So I'm just going to talk about a synthesis of really 3 projects. Markku asked me to talk about the returnee entrepreneurship paper that I wrote and published in Research Policy. And I don't like to talk a lot about the past. I like to talk about sort of maybe it's that California, the future is what counts, the past is irrelevant. I'm in Europe, so I don't start throwing things at me. It's just the California perspective. My dad was a historian, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the returnee entrepreneurship data, and then I'm going to talk about the geography of foreign venture capital investment in China, and then something about management teams in Chinese firms listing in the US market. And I think those of you who are interested in clusters will see how this all attaches to clusters, and particularly international relationships between clusters. So hopefully this will all come together at the end here. This is empirical observations. One of the empirical observations that's sort of in the literature is that Taiwan, China, and India have experienced a remarkable economic development with ICT as the propulsive sector. Somebody mentioned Danny Roderick yesterday, and this is sort of Danny Roderick's thesis, or Dan Bresnitz's thesis in his book, on his recent book on China. The other observation, Annalise Saxenian has made this, is that Taiwanese, Chinese, and Indians are a large group of tech entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley. They're really a very important group of entrepreneurs. And many of these individuals, she observed in her Argonauts book, are flowing back and forth between the US and their country of origin. So those are kind of the empirical observations that I want to address here. Let's see. Okay, and we all know the context: lower costs of travel, easing visa restrictions, diffusion of technical skills, increasingly global labor markets for highly skilled employees, and increased cross-national corporate activities. We've heard a lot about that here at the conference. So that's the context within which I want to talk about. And of course, Annelies Saxenian's sort of is formerly was considered a brain drain. It was a big literature for about 30 years. And recently, this is being reframed into transnationalisms, Luis Guarnizo, Michael Petersmith, and then Annelies' sort of ideas of brain circulation. So I want to look at all of these empirically and try to see what we can draw out of them. And more recently, the World Bank has been reframing immigrants as assets for development. Right? So what does the empirical data tell us? Well, to presage, the story is quite complicated and it differs by nation, but we'll look at that in a little more detail. And the importance of what we're going to argue, or I'm going to argue, and Danny Bresnitz and I argued in the research policy paper, is the importance of indigenous action. And we've sort of talked about that when people have been talking about clusters. Marianne Feldman and Janet Berkowitz wrote an article about how do clusters come about, how do these industries emerge. And we're going to argue that local entrepreneurs were really very important, and then state action and multinational corporations as agents of knowledge transfer. Bruce Kogut has written a lot about this. And what I'd call the creation of absorptive capacity in these other countries. And I'll discuss that a little later, but I think this is really important, is when you think about these transnational cluster relationships, is what is the absorptive capacity for the new cluster that's emerging? A methodological note is this is a lot of secondary sources, did a few direct interviews, but there are a lot of archived interviews. We did entrepreneur identification, so we really get down to the entrepreneur level and try to identify them through a variety of sources. And my China data is, again, Darius yesterday spoke about the use of corporate databases. And increasingly, as we study entrepreneurship, if we want to do this beyond interviews and case studies, there are databases that we can access, though unfortunately they cost a lot of money. Web searches. And then I use a lot of Securities and Exchange Commission filings, really government filings. It's really quite detailed, and I have armies of undergraduates pulling data out. So this also needs to be financed, which is always a problem. But the Kaufman Foundation just sent me an email. They're finding a little bit more of my work. So I had a good email this morning. So let's talk about Taiwan. And this is really Annelies Saxenian when she's talking about the brain circulation. She's really using the Taiwanese case. So Danny Bresnitz and I actually decided to let's look in detail about how that cluster emerged and look at the entrepreneurs that drove the emergence of the cluster. And so we looked at PC Assembly, think companies like Acer. So we pulled all of the companies that were in her book, and then we looked at, well, who were the entrepreneurs and what were their experiences? So the Argonaut story is a story of going to the United States in particular and then coming back to Taiwan and starting firms. So we asked the question, is this the story of how the major firms were started? And there we had to look at the entrepreneurs themselves. Who started the firm? And in PC Assembly, which was the earliest part of the growth of the Taiwanese ICT industry, that was actually not the case. It was not the case that it was returnees. It was actually this indigenous entrepreneurship that gets going. And I'll describe the process in the next couple slides. On top of that then was built yet another industry, which is called the contract semiconductor manufacturing firms. For those of you who know the literature, Taiwan Semiconductor, TSMC, United Microelectronics, or a whole set of these semiconductor manufacturers. These are coming later, so we're going down in historical time, and what do you know? This is a more sophisticated process, and she has a stronger case now, that the 2 out of the 3 firms were actually founded by returnees. Right? So we have to see this cluster evolving historically, and that was part of a discourse that I heard various people talking about in sessions. But this is really hard work. You've really got to get down and dirty in the weeds and find these firms and identify them. So she had a stronger case. Then, on top of that, so what we've got is a cluster that's growing and layering, right? We had the semiconductor design, which is yet more sophisticated. That's a lot of algorithms. You need PhD engineers in that sort of process. And that's where her strongest case comes, where 9 out of the 12 key firms that we were able to identify actually had returnees, people with PhDs from American universities. And we go in greater detail. We look at where did they get their degree, where did they work, to see if it was a Silicon Valley, because her argument is really a Silicon Valley returnee, cluster to cluster. We find that that's actually not true. They came from other firms like RCA, IBM, which are not Silicon Valley firms. So we try to identify this. So to some degree, it's cluster to cluster, but it's not quite as she describes it. And what this is telling me is that we have to be very careful just using interviews, because her research was basically based on interviews, but we actually have to get down there at the empirical level and find out what the real data is so we can understand what actually happened if we're trying to understand cluster formation and growth. Okay, so our conclusion on this one, and I'm going to go through Taiwan, India, and China. I'm going to skip India and go to China because I think that in many respects is the most interesting one. But it underestimates the role of the earliest local entrepreneurs, right? We think about forming new clusters, local entrepreneurs, even in these cases where there's an interaction between a dominant cluster, Silicon Valley, or the United States. Here we're talking about a developing country. We need to actually look at the earliest entrepreneurs. And Marianne Feldman and Janet Berkowitz wrote a wonderful, wonderful paper on the creation of clusters and how it occurs and how entrepreneurs, in the process of creating their firms, can create clusters. Then the other thing, of course, is the role of the state, institutional entrepreneurship, as Marco was referring to. But it's, in this particular case, it's not the role of the state coming down and making things happen. We've seen too many of those technopolises, policies, etc., that fail. But it's really the state interacting with a set of entrepreneurs in the environment, and the state being entrepreneurial also in that interaction process. And then, of course, in the particular case of Taiwan, is the role of multinationals and the role of knowledge transfer through multinationals, that the state was very active in trying to pluck knowledge out and create partnerships between the multinationals and the local entrepreneurs to get that process of technology transfer to operate. And we can see case after case where multinationals, the maquiladoras in Mexico, for example, where there was no interaction between the local entrepreneurs, and these are just platforms. So the role of the state in taking these and making it more than just a platform, but actually merging it with the local ecosystem is a very important part of this. Okay. So what are the key systems then? Ecosystem development, local entrepreneurship, government policy, building absorptive capacity. Building the capacity to absorb the knowledge that's coming in. And when that absorptive capacity is created, then the returnees, who are coming from a more sophisticated technological arena, can actually interact with that environment. Very, very crucial and often forgotten. And then they can come use their skills and contacts because they have a context within which that knowledge, the knowledge that they're bringing, can actually be actualized. And then, of course, in this particular case, as Taiwan evolves, then it can increasingly have a symbiotic relationship with the other cluster, in this case, Silicon Valley. So Taiwan is a really interesting case, but it's much more complicated than just returnees sort of coming back and integrating in and creating a cluster. We argue it's much more complicated. The historical record shows that. I'll just skip India. If you want to read the paper, it's in Research Policy. India has a little bit of a different case, but I'm going to skip it because in the interests of time, I think it would be better to do so. So China. The Chinese case is really interesting because what would we normally expect? It would look just like Taiwan, right? Taiwan is Chinese and it's a big Taiwan, right? So many people think of. Well, what's interesting about the Chinese case is that there was no returnee involvement in the first wave of entrepreneurial firms. So if we took the model that we used for Taiwan, we just dropped it onto China, we find out, oh, that's really not going to work. It's a different case. Now, I'll show how returnees start to become important, but it's a bit later. All the spin-offs, the early ones, think of Legend now Lenovo, Huawei, all of the big Chinese players, the early players, were all indigenous firms. And this was an ecosystem built by government policy, indigenous entrepreneurs, and the multinationals coming in slightly later being important as tech transfer. And if you think about Chinese policy, right, which all American firms and European firms complain about, is Chinese policy is always to extract the technology, right, and transfer it. I mean, it's completely understandable, right? And to make you do joint ventures with Chinese partners, all these transfer mechanisms. But the Chinese case is really indigenous initially. And then along comes the internet bubble. And the internet bubble is really quite interesting because that is when the returnees start to play an important role. It's a new phase in the global technological development. And when the internet bubble comes, there's already now an ecosystem and some absorptive capacity in the Chinese marketplace, in the Chinese economy, and returnees start to become important. And I had a whole bunch of tables, but I just took them out, and I will summarize them rather than using all of my tables because I think it would just sort of waste time. Returnees become very important then. Of the early leading firms, Baidu, I don't know if you know these names, but they're leading Chinese firms. 3 out of 8 were returnees formed. The other 5 were not. And already, and we've all read about, or many of us who spend time in China, Zhengquanjun ICT cluster in Beijing was already fully blooming and growing, and into this, the returnees come. Mike Wright has written some work on this, on the role of returnees, so there's a literature in the management literature about that. So now we're going to skip to what I'm just analyzing right now, is the foreign venture capitalists investing into China, right? And what I have here is a picture. Is my light working? Yeah, I screwed that up, didn't I? Sorry about that. Let's see. Oh, there it is. It's not very strong. This is 2000, right? The internet bubble. And you start to have some venture capital investment, Beijing, Shanghai, relatively small. 2005, 2012, you have this massive growth. And this is foreign venture capital investments. What's really quite interesting about this, 50% of this investment is from California. This is a cluster-to-cluster investment. I mean, there's really 2 clusters. There's Beijing and a lesser degree Shanghai. We analyze all the foreign venture capitalists, so we're looking at where the foreign venture capitalists are headquartered and where they're investing, and it becomes quite complicated. But the big story here is this connection of foreign venture capitalists. Now, what I'm going to do next is show you the role of returnees. I'm going to start to show you that. Okay, so what I do is then a deeper dive into these Chinese. I look at all Chinese IPOs in the US market, an N of 120 firms, and I look at every single individual that is on the board of directors or the management team at the moment of the IPO. There's some problems with that, but that's the best reporting we can get. And what you would think is that's listed on the US market, so there should be startups with a large number of returnees. This firm's going to be listed on the US market. So we examined all the board of directors, all the managers, and all the members of the board of directors by function, identified the major career experience for every single one of them. Right? This is 1,400 individuals. This is not a trivial task. It's reported in their filings, but it has to be pulled out by hand. And then we started to look at, well, who are these people and where did they come from? This is all personnel. This is all the personnel that we looked at, their characteristics, and what were their experiences, right? And the significance levels are all down here. And this is a time series, so we're looking at IPOs that are coming just like that, and we're looking at everybody. 10 minutes, I'll be done in 10 minutes. Looking at everybody, and what do we find? What we find is in the early days, returnees are very important, relatively important, and over time they become less important, right? So the returnee phenomenon is important at the very early days, and then it becomes less important over time. And these are IPOs in the US market, and we were kind of surprised by that, so then we started to look a little more carefully. We looked at the founders, and we found sort of the same, let's see, go back. The founders, there we have, right, becoming more Chinese over time. We also look at whether they have Chinese names. We look at whether they have mainland education. So it's a very sort of complicated graphics. But what this shows is kind of what you'd expect. CEO founders over time become more and more Chinese. We're taking IPOs not at each time. Then we looked at chief financial officers. Kind of interesting. Right? Chief financial officer is the representative in the firm, the manager who talks to the investors. This is the person who has to communicate with the American investors. What did we find there? Actually, we found, though they became more Chinese, they continued to have American experience. Right? So there was a higher number of returnees on the people who had to interact globally versus the founders, which are becoming more Chinese over time. Right? Less returnees, more Chinese over time. So when you look at the firm itself, if you get really down micro, you start to see that different people are picked for different characteristics of their relationship to the global economy. And we did the same thing for VC directors, venture capital directors, and venture capital directors stayed quite American, because again, they're representatives to finance capital. From Darius's presentation yesterday, this is the role of finance capital at the very micro level in Chinese firms. So what do we see here is what we see is returnees have different, in different time periods, they have different roles, and then they have different roles in the management team and in the controlling board of directors over time. So, what do I want to bring this all down to? In the case of China, we have a little bit different relationship. Initially, returnees are not important at all. When the Chinese ecosystem develops and starts to develop absorptive capacity, all of a sudden, these people abroad have opportunities. Now they can come back because the absorptive capacity, the ability for them to utilize their skills has changed, has grown, has improved. And later, if we look at the most recent period, now returnees are not important for starting the firms anymore. They're important for interlocutors to the global economy. to the finance, etc. So the role of returnees changes over time in relationship to the economy. Okay, some conclusions. Ecosystem ignition, right? I think this is local entrepreneurs. Without the local entrepreneurs, you can't ignite that ecosystem, right? And so as we start to understand the development and history of clusters, we need to look at the early entrepreneurs, these in many ways are more than just entrepreneurs with their own firms. Actually, I don't know if they're institutional entrepreneurs, but they're regional entrepreneurs. They help build the region. And Feldman and Berkowitz's article is just great on that. Returnees were not the key to take off, but they become assets, right, that can be attracted in later as the institutional thickness, if you want to, grows. Then they can be attracted because then they can start to use the skills and knowledge that they developed abroad. The role of the state, I mean, that has come up repeatedly, but we need to understand that. If we want to understand clusters, we need to understand that at a micro level. Really need to know what happened. And it's not just, you know, the state has a role. That's nice. Nice thing to say. It's probably true. But actually, how did it work? To understand the mechanisms. And then in my particular cases of these three nations and these three industries, the role of the multinationals is really quite important in a tech transfer, in the tech transfer process. So, I mean, I think we all know this, but it's worth repeating. Powerful ecosystems, and the ones I'm talking to are quite powerful, they're global class, are almost always the product of complex coevolutions, or even bricolage, as pieces are brought together, as entrepreneurs bring pieces together of different things to grow the region. And generally speaking, of course, in our cases, the role of the MNCs is underestimated. So when we have these kind of clusters, I think also we need to think about the interaction with the rest of the world and understand that it's complicated and multifaceted. And once again, we need to look very much at the micro level to understand the richness of this, not just, oh, it's returnees, or oh, it's MNCs, but it's actually how does that process work. So, new ecosystem formation in these particular cases was a knitting together of local and global elements. To bring these two together is how these ecosystems were put together. Just a brief note on methodology. As a research policy editor, I just wanted to make this, the usefulness of mixed methods. I think what we're seeing more and more is the use of mixed methods in the research, and I think it gives us a better way of understanding than often just, let's say, interview-based papers. Archives, right? So lots online now, but often you still need to get your hands dusty. There's a lot of need to get the hands dusty. To do some of this work, we really had to get down and dirty in some archives. Quantitative data is really, I think, more and more important to be integrated with the interview data and the historical data. I think it's quite important. And particularly the use of corporate databases. Again, Darius mentioned that yesterday. This seems to be the way a lot of people are going. Policy implications again. Indigenous firms and ecosystems are critical. We need to understand that for how these grow. We need to understand how absorptive capacity is created. And then these are just strong educational system. In these three cases, the strong educational system was really important at the undergraduate level, but in these cases, all the graduate education was abroad. And ICT is vitally important if you're thinking about development. I think Roderick and Bresnitz are right. They're really important areas to try to build economic development. With that, that is UC Davis, Napa Valley. That's our cluster. And so with that, I'll leave you with a pleasant picture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin, for a beautiful presentation, extremely interesting. Clearly there's a theme emerging, swamp football, getting down and dirty, which is coming through. That's right. Our final speaker today, last but not least, is Simone Strambach. She is the Professor for Services, Communication and Innovation at the Department of Geography, Philipps University, Marburg. She's written extensively on innovation, the geography of knowledge, economics and institutional foundation of the knowledge economy. She's got a particular interest in knowledge-intensive services and long-term technological and socio-economic change. And today she's speaking on the theme of combining knowledges in sustainable innovation processes, boundary crossing, microdynamics of knowledge in green construction. So, Simone.
So hello, thank you very much at first to invite me here on such an interesting conference where we had the possibility to exchange our experiences concerning the future development of regions and cities. And when we are thinking and talking about what we are calling mega trends and mega problems which are globally, so then of course sustainable innovation process become much more important in the last years, and we could see this all as in the research as well as in our policy fields. And I would like today talk a little bit about knowledge dynamics behind sustainable innovation processes. And don't fear, that is not really a new concept. I think I can line up with a lot of issues my colleagues raised before. So my main argument is that behind such kinds or types of innovative changes, we have a combination of knowledge which are strongly affected by institutions and organizational dimensions. And I would like to go in a first way. First, I would like to raise some points concerning this complex relationship between sustainability, innovation, and knowledge dynamics. Because long time these trends were very separated from each other, and only recently we have this discussion on sustainable innovations. And when we are talking about agents of knowledge, of course, business-intensive service industries become agents of knowledge. We know a lot about it coming from the innovation research, and even here in Tampere we have a hub on KIPS research in Europe. So, and on my third step, I will show you really on a micro level a case study, so I hope you will follow me in this dirty field, as Martin say, and let me then just raise some examples, some conclusions about the territorial shaping of knowledge dynamics in this kind of innovation processes. So, when I come to my first point, so then I would like to say that sustainability is really, we can say, an old concept, nearly. But in the last years, we see really here in the literature a change. And this came along also with a changing understanding in the innovation studies and innovation literature. And so from the sustainable from the sustainable discussion point, we could say that sustainability is no longer really seen as a static idle stage. It is much more seen as a context-specific and dynamic process. And we could see that the relativeness and the concentration of all three dimensions in these developments which we know or name as sustainable is very important. And what we could really see is that sustainability is no more seen as a state, and how to evaluate sustainability is much more perceived as a process. And if an artifact is sustainable or not, the evaluation point is our perspective now. And that means that what is sustainable, even if it's not really defined, it's very much context and time specific. And when we come now to the point of innovations, that is a little bit a paradox, because innovations, we understand innovations normally as undirected novelties with unsecurity, with risk, and the outcome is not totally clear, and we have then products, processes, organizations which have a certain kind of novelty. So, but when we are talking now about sustainable novelties, so then we have a certain direction or directionality concerning such changes which we evaluate as sustainable. And as is often the case in such new areas, at the moment we have a lot of discussions, lacks and discourses in terminologies, but nevertheless some characteristics can be found out. What are the really endogenous, how could I say, the endogenous characteristics of sustainable novelties. And compared, for example, to eco-innovations or environmental innovations, which are mostly focused on one dimension, the ecological dimension mostly, these discussions really underline the three dimensions and the blending of all three dimensions as an important point. And even in the context specificity, and this emphasizes the social dimension, gains much more important in innovation research, especially when we are talking about a global sustainable development in a long-term perspective. And a second point, which is pointed out, where sustainable innovations are different from other innovations, and that is discussed under the label of double externalities. Of course, every innovation produces positive externalities, because through the knowledge spillovers and investments in research and development, through other economic sectors, we have these externalities. But in the case of sustainable innovations, it is discussed that a second kind of externalities emerge later in time on a system level. And this externality is for non-profit, for people who are engaged in such innovations, or for firms who are engaged in such innovations. Though that means the social needs and the positive externalities on the social dimension comes not back as any kind of profit for these innovations. And that is the case why, when I come to the third point, why technological push or market pull often are not sufficient for such kinds of innovations. And often we have a regulatory push to introduce or to give such kind of opportunities over time. So, and when I'm now speaking about sustainable innovations, you have here in definition, I understand these novelties as the creation and implementation of changes which contribute to natural sources, but also to a change in economic styles and in styles of consumption in a long term. And of course, in innovation studies, here we have in recent years taken up sustainability in the innovation studies, and especially when you are looking on the transition or transformation theory and literature, and here you can see one of the last regional study paper from Truva and Conan. And they speak about the geography of sustainability, and coming from the multi-actor and multi-level co-evolution of socio-technical systems, they really say, okay, in this literature we have really disregarded spatial aspects in the depths. And they also argue that the technological fix is a focus which is not enough and which really neglects also the social dimension. And in their paper, they call and say, okay, how sustainable commerce itself might lead to fundamental transformation knowledge in this for from tradition that especially social and institutional changes are underrepresented. And he says it's crucial really to take this in. And last but not least, when we are looking on transition management, which has more the policy focus and was developed from colleagues here in Europe 10 years ago, and it's now in practice for 10 years. So they take up this multi-level and multi-scale evolution of technical systems, and they also pronounce the co-evolution of the societal process and the change of formal and informal institutions which are necessary in transition management. And in a last paper, Rotmans and Lorbach take stake of the transition management over the 10 years and on policies there, and they came to the conclusion that every transition project is unique and has a special contextualization, and there is no standard receipt how to manage and how to foster sustainable changes, transitions. So when we summarize these discussions on different levels concerning sustainable innovative changes, we can really say that the adaptation to the combination of nations or this project, and we experimented with this concept and tried to get a new understanding on knowledge interactions which underlie innovations, which lead to innovations. That means when we are focus on the knowledge interactions and dynamics. So we shift the focus from the innovation itself to the knowledge interaction processes over time and space, which actually lead to these innovation events. So in a way, every innovation can be seen as a visible result from innovation. And today I would like to talk a little bit about microdynamics, and microdynamics emerge through the interaction of knowledge creation, use, transformation of individuals, of firms, in networks between firms, and here we are really on this dirty micro level as Martin raised before. So one of my main statements is that combinatorial knowledge dynamics, which is characteristic for kind of innovations, are always characterized by combinations. That means that heterogeneous knowledge bases located in firms or by individuals in different institutional contexts, sectoral or regional or national, have to be combined. And that means that in such actor constellations, institutions, organizational dimensions play a role. So because knowledge, and here I have to say perhaps some words on my understanding of knowledge, because knowledge is a contested concept. So, but knowledge, as I understand it, in here refer to stare to knowledge, economies, structure of knowledge, and can knowledge go and cumulative have a certain kind of differences. We know a lot of knowledge interactions and the influence of institutions, because institutions are built in interactions, legitimized, changed, and over time they really foster competence building and accumulation. And on we have different really substantial empirical and theoretical strands which point on the importance of institutional different aggregated level. When you are looking, for example, on the firm level, organizational routines, organizational capabilities are very important for firms, and what firms have done in the past foster innovations in a certain direction in the firm, on a firm level. We have also know a lot about sector-specific institutions and organizational forms, and that's the reason why the industry difference always has different One is the place specificity, the institutions, institutional ecology and environment specific for a place. But on the other hand, also space in the sense of proximity economies, in the space of, in its influence on reducing physical proximity and interactions may reduce cognitive distance. And here behind you, you can see just what I think we can take out from this literature is characteristic in actor constellations in a way for combinatorial dynamics is that we have not so much institutional overlaps and that we have to bridge a lot of interfaces and a lot of variety of contexts, and that means that communication, the investment in the understanding is of a high level. So let me just come to my empirical part, because I would like to show you a case study where knowledge-intensive business services from Germany are involved in sustainable, innovative projects in China. And when we are looking on such transnational sustainable projects, they are very interesting because we are talking about leapfrogging possibilities in such constellations, which mean when we are really successful that we could bring in knowledge from our context concerning efficient, eco-efficient technologies or others to such contexts and our institutions to concerning the life or consumption style change to more sustainable awareness, then these fast-growing economies could jump over some energy consumption and living styles. So there's a lot of potential, but on the other hand, this kind of constellations in these transnational constellations produce new challenges for interaction processes. So just a short word in the green construction, because here we see that combination. Green construction is a part of the green tech industry, and you can see that the combination of synthetic knowledge fields in different areas is very important for energy efficient buildings. From optimized design till materials or till energy efficiency or water efficiency, we have different synthetic knowledge fields. And of course, in a different institutional and cultural context, we have the localization and the combination with lifestyles, with culture, and otherwise, when we really taking the sustainable character, the change has not really this value. And here behind, you have a picture from Anting, which is one of a complete disaster created by a German KIPS, and we have a lot of such failed international projects. It was an awarded competition for a German KIPS to create a new city in Shanghai for 50,000 peoples. And first, the client would like to have a middle-aged German town, but the technology KIPS could really convince the client for a European city, and it is in a Bauhaus style, designed with a lot of ecological, efficient technologies inside. The master plan started in 2000. And what I have to say is the German firm gave up in 2004 and left China, and because he really can't cope with all these bargaining processes, and he feel like a ping ball, and so he gave up, and the Chinese client really finished Anting. And Anting has now a lot of vacancies. And also people claim about bad construction. And this came across because on the one hand, Chinese people afterwards take low material and other things. And on the other hand, no Chinese residents do not want to buy apartments with a East or Western orientation, because in China, under cultural and social status, only the north-south direction is very valued and has a high rent price. And so the European construction and the European model was not really really adapted to this cultural context. So that one of a lot of such projects we could see. So, but in line with time, I would like to come a little bit deeper to the micro level, and only could raise the institutional comparative thing on the national level in a very rough manner. In Germany, the technological push and regulatory push in environmental technology started very early, and that means we have a really well-established institutionalization process in green construction. There are standard settings for sustainable innovation construction projects, criteria, indicators, measures, and all these things. And we have also developed organizational routines, holistic planning routines for making this combination really happen from the beginning on. There are complex communication processes. And so Germany has over the time really strong characteristics as a lead market, and this reputation helps small KIPS firms especially to get large projects in China. And the Chinese market is very attractive for German firms, because here it's possible to create whole cities, parts of cities, and this is not possible anymore in Europe. So the controversial picture we have in Germany, in China, sorry, from the institutional setting, that means sustainability came in very recently. In studies, we could see that on the national level, the national government really has a strong will to foster it, but at the moment we could see weak processes in the institutionalization gaps here, and also economic factors and lifestyle factors hinder the coming through of construction. And in my last minute, I will even give you some glances in these knowledge processes we use, innovation biographies. Perhaps if someone is interested, we can discuss it later on. That means we followed innovation events over time and space and try to grasp the dynamics behind. And I would like to show you some things concerning the project of the Botanical Garden in Shanghai. A huge project unique this project was a lot of sustainable technologies and artifacts created, and here you can see the main actors involved and their location. And I just would like to show you here the knowledge combination. We used the taxonomy of Asheim and divided knowledge bases in synthetic and symbolic knowledge. And we were especially interested in which actors bring in and how comes in which kind of organizational forms the symbolic and cultural knowledge in such innovative, creative projects. And here you can see the actors, and you see especially also in the KIP sector, they are concentrated in Europe as in Germany in agglomeration areas. They are specialized, and they are used really to work in distance and to create knowledge from different locations and combine it. And what is really a strong a mechanism in knowledge combination seems to be the dynamic establishment of proximity, of physical proximity, and different forms of proximity. We could, in all these projects, see or differentiate three forms. On the one hand, you have more short time visits from one day, but also, on the other hand, another form which at least needs a week to come together. And even you see that the three main actors rent for all the period an issue in an office in Munich together. And here I skip a little bit, but interesting is also that Chinese employees and people from Germany working in China for a time play a very important role in bringing in and adapting innovations and knowledge creation in this point. But on the other hand, in a more general level, you can really see that some sustainable artifacts are not really realized. This is a point we have seen when we generalize more projects that the organization in value chains is totally different, and this creates a loss of frictions and also of loss of sustainable artifacts. So now I come really to my conclusion, and I would only raise some points concerning the territorial shaping of combinatorial knowledge dynamics. And what was really surprising was the multiscalarity, the dynamics really of organizational forms which were built and within these cooperation networks. And they shape also the territory, because we see no new network building on the one hand, and on the other hand, through learning effects, we could see that processes within firms also are changing. But yeah, I could discuss. Thank you very much.